Welcome to Family Matters. I'm Justice Harvey Brownstone, and on this episode, we will be discussing what I think is the most important aspect of the family justice system. In fact, I think it's the most important aspect of the entire justice system because we're talking about child protection. I'm sure every family court judge would agree with me when I say that the most heart-wrenching and emotionally draining cases we deal with are those that involve child abuse and child neglect. And yet, it's very rare to see a television program that explains how the child protection system works. What is child abuse? What is child neglect? Why does it happen? How does the justice system protect children? And what happens when a child protection agency intervenes in a child's life? Our guests today are going to help explain all of this. Let's meet them. First, we have a lawyer with 23 years experience who's represented parents, children, and child protection agencies. Please welcome Ms. Jennifer Barrett. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Also with us is a woman who's practiced law for 18 years and frequently represents parents in child protection cases. Please help me welcome Ms. Crystal Buchan. Thank you so much for being here. Jennifer, Crystal, welcome. Thank you for being here to discuss what I think is the most important topic that we will probably ever cover on this show. Jennifer, you have been a lawyer first in Ontario for 17 years and then 6 years in British Columbia. You've represented parents and children. You're a mediator and a collaborative lawyer, and you also act on behalf of the Child Protection Agency here in British Columbia.
That's correct, yes.
And Crystal, you represent parents in those cases. Can I ask you both, what drew you into this line of work? Jennifer, why child protection?
Well, initially when I began involvement with, as a lawyer, I did a lot of family law, and that involved a lot of child protection. Initially, I acted for parents, and as time went on, I had the opportunity to also act on behalf of the Child Protection Agency in Ontario initially, and then here.
Did something about protecting children resonate with you as a lawyer or on some emotional level? It's not an area of law that a lot of lawyers gravitate to.
Personally, I really enjoy the area. I like working with the fact that we're trying to deal with children and families and do what's best for children in the long run through using the legal system, essentially.
And what about you, Crystal? What was it about child protection that made you want to pursue a career doing a lot of that work?
I agree with you that I think this is the most difficult area of law. I think this is the area of family law in which parents need a lawyer who is willing to get into the trenches with them and really walk a very difficult walk. And I felt like I had the skills to do that. The other thing that drew me to this area of law is I really do believe that people can grow and change. And this is an area in which we see people improving themselves often in amazing ways. And what people will do for their children is amazing. And every day I see that in my practice.
Well, I don't think there's anything more important that a parent can do than the best for their children. Tell me, I've mentioned in the introduction abuse, neglect. These are terms we hear a lot. Do you have a definition of child abuse that you refer to, that you think captures what it means to the ordinary person in terms of when the legal system gets involved?
Well, I don't. The statute, depending on what province you're in, defines or state, essentially has guidelines with respect to what is commonly known as children in need of protection, and abuse falls within one of those categories. I think,
and there's different types of abuse, aren't there? I mean,
yes.
we all know that there's physical abuse.
Yes.
Sometimes it's because a parent is over-disciplining a child, perhaps hitting a child with a hand, a fist, a weapon, a belt, whatever. There's other kinds of abuse too, though, aren't there?
I think as time goes on and you practice more in child protection, there are a number of situations that give rise to what people would consider abuse, such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. So personally, I would consider it somewhat an evolving thing that is impacted by changes in families and also...
and don't you think there's changes in the way society perceives what is abuse? You know, I often get parents in my court telling me, well, when I was raised, my parents hit me, I turned out okay, that's how I was disciplined. And emotional abuse is frankly something that only recently come into the definition of abuse in the law. What do you think, Crystal, emotional abuse is? If you had to explain it to a client.
I think we have to look at what the child is demonstrating or experiencing. So if we see a child who is experiencing or demonstrating anxiety, if they have behaviors at home or school that cause concern, then we look behind to see if there's something going on in the household that could cause that. And that's where we sometimes see that there are things going on in the household that are abusive. And I also agree with you, a lot of the people that I work with are people whose families have been involved with the child protection system through generations. So they've learned things from their parents that maybe weren't optimal parenting techniques that they now are employing in their household. And as time moves on, we're learning more and more about how what we say and do affect our children. And as lawyers, we're wanting to draw our clients' attention to what they can do to improve how they treat their children and to give their children the best childhood.
But you know, one of the things I hear a lot in court from parents is that who have been accused of abuse is, I would never abuse my child. There is no way that I would ever abuse my child. And I find it important to make it clear to people that you don't necessarily have to intend it. Abuse can occur with good intentions, without an intent to cause harm. You don't need to intend to hurt a child to be perhaps unwittingly, inadvertently causing abuse. Yeah, and I'm thinking particularly with emotional abuse. Do you see cases where parents, for example, may be involved in either criminal activity or substance abuse or maybe in a conflict with each other that's causing emotional harm to their children without the parents maybe realizing it?
Well, as I said, we have to look at what's happening with the child. How is what's happening in their household affecting them? So when my clients say, I would never abuse my child, then I have to ask them, how do you think your child feels when they hear you arguing after they go to bed at night? Or how do you think your child feels when they're not sure that they're going to have breakfast in the morning? These are our clients don't always see the way that the things they do affect their children, and so part of what we're doing is trying to educate people so that instead of looking at the label, look at what is happening for your child. If you go back to it and instead of saying you're an abuser, but what is your child's experience? How can we improve your child's experience? It's easier for a parent to hear.
What's the process that a parent has to go through to get that insight? Is their lawyer the one that does that? Because I wouldn't want people to think that because we have two lawyers sitting here that the child protection system is lawyer-based.
No, typically this is the work of the social worker. The social worker will identify for the parent and for the lawyer what he or she thinks is going on in the household and how he or she would like to see that matter resolved, and refer the client out to community agencies to receive those services. And as a lawyer, my job is to help communicate with the social worker what my client feels are issues that they can deal with, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. I do get to know my client better because my client trusts me, whereas they may not trust the social worker. And so there are sometimes cultural issues, literacy issues, cognitive issues, addiction issues that the social worker may know some things about, but not everything. And as a lawyer, I see myself sometimes as a safe person to communicate those issues to the social worker and help the social worker work with the parent to develop a plan to refer them out to community agencies.
Now, what about neglect? How do you explain the term neglect, child neglect?
Well, neglect is more of a situation where there's a failure to provide for the necessary things the child needs. For instance, fail to provide food, shelter.
What about not getting a child to school?
Well, in that type of thing, not routine even to a certain degree in the whole scheme of things, like getting the children to their medical appointments, ensuring that their needs are met, whatever those needs are. And so basically situations of neglect can come to the attention of schools, for instance, when children don't show up on time, show up indicating that they've had to get themselves to school because for whatever reason there's a parent not available.
I've seen cases where children were sent to school with no lunch.
No lunch.
Or sent to school in the winter with no coat.
Appropriate clothing. So those types of things. So it's not providing for those things that a child needs day in, day out.
And is it fair to say that with neglect, it's a pattern of parental behavior? It's not an isolated incident. It's a recurring pattern. It's a parenting style that seems to not meet a child's needs. Is that fair?
I'd say so.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's what that's what abuse and neglect are. What kind of parents? Who are these people that find themselves in this situation? Crystal, you were saying some of them were not properly parented themselves.
Yes.
And were involved in the child protection system as children.
Absolutely.
What about other situations?
I think anyone could find themselves under the radar of what the Child Protection Agency and their community.
I think that statement would come as a huge surprise to most people watching this telecast, that anybody could find themselves with a knock at the door from a child protection agency.
Absolutely.
Why do you say that?
Because I've had clients as varied as you might imagine, from the richest in our community to the poorest, to the best, from the best educated to the least educated.
So child abuse and child neglect have nothing to do with poverty, wealth, culture, socioeconomic standing in society?
I wouldn't say nothing.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say nothing, but it would be also a mistake to say that it has everything to do with it.
It's not isolated to those situations of poverty and people with cognitive delays or drug addiction or alcohol issues. Drug addiction and alcohol issues can cross the spectrum.
And mental health problems too?
And mental health problems, absolutely.
Domestic violence?
Right.
Domestic violence and also just very, very high conflict. Separation and divorce situations as well are coming to the attention of child protection agencies as a child protection concern.
Okay. When we return, we're going to talk about how we develop good parenting skills and what can happen to a family when a child protection agency intervenes. Stay with us. Welcome back to Family Matters. I'm Justice Harvey Brownstone, and we're talking with two lawyers who work in the child protection system, Jennifer Barrett and Crystal Buchan. I want to ask you both, where do we get parenting skills from? Are you born with it? Is it your parents that teach you? Can you take a course? How do we learn how to be parents? Children don't come with a manual.
No, I think it's a combination probably of a lot of those things. I think The parenting skills that people develop are those that they're taught when they're young, and they're raised within a certain environment with parenting skills. There are courses that are available for parents, new or not new, that are out there in the community or provided by services, some more intensive than others. So there are courses that are available to assist people in learning and developing parenting skills if they haven't been taught parenting skills that are helping them parent their children.
Now, Crystal, I found it interesting. You represent parents, and you said earlier that you believe that people can change.
Absolutely.
That's going to be very important as we continue this conversation, because I want to now get into what happens when a child protection agency gets involved. Let's start at the beginning. How does it happen? Who calls them? How can it happen?
It's important to keep in mind that if anyone on the street, for instance, sees a child that appears to be at risk, they have a legal obligation to call the child protection agency.
So it
there's
could be
a
somebody
duty to report.
Somebody in the parking lot at the grocery store sees another parent physically assaulting their child. They could call. It could happen from an anonymous member of the public. What are the other ways that you've heard of the agency getting called?
Well, of course, all of the community professionals that touch on a children's life, their doctor, their teacher, their daycare provider, these are the most common places where particularly neglect, which happens over time, comes to someone's attention. The stranger reports, of course, that someone saw the person in the grocery store or on the street also happen. Your neighbors,
But in terms of the
friends, your
professionals,
family members.
In terms of the professionals you talked about, doctors, teachers, daycare centers, in most jurisdictions, they have a legal obligation to make that call.
Yes.
If they
Yes.
suspect abuse or neglect.
Absolutely.
Isn't that right? And then you have, as you were saying, neighbors. Do you see cases where an ex-partner who may be angry with an axe to grind makes a call?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a
So
lot
it
of
can happen that way?
spiteful calls. The ex-partner, the old girlfriend, the new girlfriend.
A relative?
Absolutely.
A grandparent?
Yes.
I have even seen cases where the police called because a parent got arrested.
Yes.
Well,
Recently, I had one where a child was at a department store with a parent who was shoplifting and got caught, and the child was involved in it, was being taught how to shoplift, and the parent got arrested, and the child ended up going into the care of the Children's Aid.
Yes, the police will call as well, and it doesn't. It also happens occasionally when police attend a home because of a call from someone to attend a home.
Maybe
And for
there's
instance,
a domestic dispute going on?
Domestic dispute, or even the condition of the home. If the condition of the home, in their view, is below community standards, they've been known to call the the Child Protection Agency to advise them of that as a potential child protection concern.
Now, let's assume that an agency gets a call, maybe from an anonymous caller, a neighbor. I know there are a lot of anonymous calls because some neighbors don't want the person to know that it's them that called because they're afraid of some kind of retaliation. But let's assume there's been a call. What does the agency do with that information?
Well, the agency, in response to that, is obligated to investigate that concern.
And who does that? Is that social workers?
That's a social worker.
So the agencies, every child protection agency has a staff of social workers who have to investigate. And how do they do that? They have to go out and meet with the parents and meet the child?
They would meet with the children. They would speak to the caller. They would potentially speak to other collaterals involved with the family. Collaterals meaning schools, doctors, depending on the type of report that was there. And then they would meet with the parents as well.
And most agencies that I know of are open 24 hours. They have an emergency line. They can be called at any time, 7 days a week, with an intake department. And then they'll go and do an investigation. So let's assume, for the purposes of exploring this, that an agency has done an investigation. I assume they would then have to make some determination whether they validated the complaint or not.
They do. They do. Depending on the outcome of the investigation, they will take steps to intervene or not intervene.
So what are the ways that they can intervene? Let's assume that, I guess it's obvious if they've decided that the complaint is ill-founded, it's based on some malicious person who didn't really have grounds to believe that there was a problem. That's easy. But let's say that they consider that the complaint is valid, that this child is maybe not being sent to school or not being properly cared for or is witnessing things, domestic violence, for example. What are the options that a child protection agency has?
Well, they don't have to start out going full-fledged, and typically they don't, unless it's a very serious report.
Mm-hmm. That's a very big point. I think most people give me the impression that they think that once the Children's Aid Society finds that there is a risk to a child, they go full force with all of the powers that the law gives them. But you're saying that's not necessarily what they'll do.
No, and a good social worker will think about the consequences of what he or she is asking of this family on the child. So in this jurisdiction, we use the term least intrusive measures. So the social worker here is obliged to look at ways in which to work with the family that have the least intrusive effect on the child.
They have to take steps to protect the child that are the least intrusive to the family?
Well,
and
yes,
I guess
to the family and to the child. And so
that's interesting. Where I work in Ontario, they have to use the least disruptive alternative. It may be the same thing.
Yeah, I think it is probably the same
So what's
thing.
the range of steps that an agency can do, starting from the least intrusive to the most intrusive? I think we all know the most intrusive would be to to apprehend the child and place the child in foster care. What's the least intrusive?
Well, typically, and this happens a lot, and people aren't aware of this, a social worker will just work with the family.
On a voluntary basis?
On a voluntary basis, draw to the family's attention what has come to his or her attention, make some suggestions, listen to what the family has to say about how they could deal with the problem. Sometimes it's as simple as that report you get from someone who has a grudge. How do we address any concern that might allow that person to make another complaint and allow the ministry or agency to stay out of your life? And
so that would be a really a very minimally intrusive option. Mm-hmm. Are there more intrusive options that don't involve foster care? For example, placing a child with a relative or an extended member of the community?
Yes, and the agency, again, has an obligation to look at what is the least intrusive or least disruptive way to help this family become reunified.
So let's say that a parent has a substance abuse problem, and it's a single parent, and that parent has agreed to go into a residential treatment facility for 90 days to get drug treatment, rehab. Mm-hmm. It's possible, isn't it, that the agency and the parent will agree that for the 90 days the child will move in with the other parent or an aunt or uncle, all voluntarily without the court involved.
Exactly.
That must happen a lot, and I never see it, judges never see it, they don't go to a lawyer.
Well, but they might come to a lawyer. They might say, I'm thinking of a voluntary care agreement of some sort for my child, and I'd like to know what the consequences are for me and for my child, and make an informed decision.
And is it possible that a child could even go into foster care on one of those voluntary care agreements without coming to court?
Yes.
So even that's possible. Mm-hmm. So really, I think that many people think that the Child Protection Agency has to start a court case. But you're making it clear that there's a lot of solutions that can happen if the parents and the agency are working cooperatively, if I've got you right, without ever going to court, even though they might go to a lawyer.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of those cases never can't come to my attention as a lawyer for the Child Protection Agency here or elsewhere, I assume. So there's a lot of work done before any court intervention, often, that that may make another report, for instance, just sort of enough then that there's sufficient concern to get the court involved. But there's a lot of responses that the social workers can make as a result of a report to assist a family in addressing the concerns that come to their attention without ever intervening court-wise.
So this leads us really to the crux of the question, which is, what is the role of a child protection agency? Because we're hearing from you that there's a lot of work they do that has nothing to do with going to court. Mm-hmm. And then there is a lot of work they do that does have to do with going to court. I can tell you that in my court in Toronto, 2 days a week, every judge in our court spends doing child protection cases. And here we're hearing that a big chunk of their work is done without court. So it seems to me that they have a dual role. On the one hand, they're there to assist and help parents overcome challenges. And on the other, they may have to commence a court case against them.
They may have to.
I wonder how social workers manage that dual role, where they're helping the parent on the one hand, but they also may have to testify against them in court on the other, and use the information they've received from them in trying to help them, but they may have to use that information in court. That must be a big challenge for social workers, to develop a good working relationship with the parent. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I think what Crystal and I find in the practice here in British Columbia is that there are many alternatives to litigation, even when litigation has begun, to resolve the issues outside of court. When do they begin?
Yeah, when do they begin it? Well, would you agree? Am I being fair that there's a dual role?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And even once the court action is started, the social workers continue in their work with the family in the attempt to keep the family unified, or to reunify the family if the child has been put in foster care, and that's their obligation.
So when do they decide to, in a sense, and I'm being a little facetious here, pull the plug and start a court case?
Well, that's after the court case begins. There's still an obligation if there's a reasonable chance that the child can be returned to the care of the family.
But what makes them decide to start one?
A court intervention?
A court case?
I would say if a removal takes place or an apprehension, then that automatically results pretty well in a court application, because you've got to be able to justify that removal within a very short period of time.
So if they decide to apprehend a child because of a risk of harm, they're going to go to court if the parent didn't consent to it.
Yeah. Sometimes when they've been working with the family in a voluntary manner and things are not progressing in the way that they might like, they also might go to court to get what we call here a supervision order. So an order that they're supervising the care of this child, even though the child hasn't been removed from his or her parents.
But if the parent's consenting to that, why would they need to go to court?
Well, it gives them a little extra
leverage.
Well, force with the parent to say, I asked you to go, for instance, voluntarily to rehab, but now we have a supervision order that requires that you abstain from drugs and alcohol, and so it gives them a little, it gives the parent a little added incentive. And of course, time limits and other things start to tick once there's a court action involved.
When we come back, what do you do when the Children's Aid knocks on your door? Do you have to cooperate? Let's hear it from the lawyers. Stay with us. Welcome back to Family Matters. Let's get to the big question. Crystal, you represent parents. When you get a call from a parent saying the Children's Aid has made a call, they want to come and see them, what advice do you give them?
I tell them they need to cooperate with the agency. They need to give them the answers they need, and they need to do the things that they've been asked to do. They don't need to agree with them, but in order to ensure that the agency can move out of their lives, they need to cooperate. Once the agency is in your life, it takes a very long time for them to get out. So it's in their best interest, both in the short term and the long term, to cooperate from the very beginning.
Now, that cooperation that you talk about can take many forms. In recent years, we're seeing children's aid societies engage in mediation and family group conferencing. Let's just talk briefly about that. How does mediation work? We have done an episode of Family Matters on mediation, but we didn't do it in the context of child protection. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us briefly how mediation would work?
Mediation can work in a number of areas. It can work before the ministry becomes involved with court. It can be involved or used at any stage of any court proceeding. It can be used to create a better environment for that cooperation, and it can get the social worker and the parents talking about what needs to be done in order to address what the Child Protection Agency sees are concerns and how the parents can address those concerns.
And so the mediator would not be an employee of the Child Protection Agency, but would be a neutral person helping the parents and the agency negotiate a resolution of the issues.
Yes,
to keep the children safe. Is that fair?
Exactly. We don't mediate whether the child needs protection. We mediate a plan to move forward and ensure the child is safe. And one of the things the mediator can do is bring together, with everyone's consent, other people, grandparents, other family members who may be interested in helping with or taking over the care of children into the room so that a plan for these children can be made.
Now that touches on family group decision-making, family group conferencing.
Yes.
How does that work? What's the goal of that?
Well, there are two different methods. One is a family case planning conference, which gets families immediately together for in a more or less an immediate type of safety plan.
The whole family?
Well, the parents are involved in choosing who attends at that or not.
So it could be grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins?
Friends.
So when they say it takes a village, sometimes it does.
It does.
To come up with a plan that will rescue children who are at risk?
Yes, and even potential children, if a parent is involved in the ministry, with the ministry or a child protection agency, they've been involved in the past and they're expecting a new child, then that process can be used to plan for that child.
That must be difficult for some parents who are very isolated and who are not really on great terms with their relatives. Do the social workers help them reconnect with relatives who they may be on the outs with?
Social workers can be very helpful with that, and not so much reconnecting, but helping the family focus on what's important here, which is really the child, and taking the focus away from the conflict within the family, which is very often why the child has come to the attention of the ministry, and focusing on how do we meet this child's needs and reduce or eliminate the conflict within your family.
So let's talk about, very briefly, let's assume that the agency has had to bring a court case and there's going to be a hearing. What are the kinds of things that parents have to know about that court hearing? I would think one of the first is that they should have a lawyer.
Yes, they should know that they have to have a lawyer. They should also know that...
And most legal aid programs provide legal counsel for parents who can't afford it.
Absolutely, because this is the most serious way, in my view, that the state intervenes in family lives, to take your children away with the potential that they will never be returned to you.
And so parents have a constitutional right to raise their own children.
Absolutely.
And so we want parents to be represented by lawyers. So I guess one major message that everyone should be getting from this show is that you should have a lawyer if you're going to be dealing with the Children's Aid Society, especially if they're taking you to court.
Absolutely.
And then what can happen at court? What are the options a judge has? If a judge determines that a child is at risk of harm, that there has been abuse or neglect, or there is a risk of it, what can a court do?
Here a judge needs to investigate whether the harm that was caused to the child, the risk of harm to the child has been either reduced or eliminated. And if it's likely, not likely to be reduced or eliminated within a reasonable period of time, then a judge can, in fact, make an order where a child is not returned to his or her parent or parents.
And that child would be in foster care?
Yes.
Now, how long can a child stay in foster care?
until essentially...
Before a permanent decision is made, a permanent long-term plan for a child.
Well, if a permanent order is made, then the Child Protection Agency then shifts its investigation into looking for a permanent plan.
That's
for
if
that
a permanent
child.
order is
Yes.
made, but we're not there yet.
Oh,
Every
okay.
jurisdiction has different time frames within their legislation as to how long a child can be in care. And for instance, here in British Columbia, the length of time a child can be in care depends upon his or her age and or the age of the youngest in their sibling group. And so we need to be aware of the time frames. Absolutely.
I guess the point I'm making to viewers is that you can't just keep your children on a shelf indefinitely and say, I'll deal with these problems eventually, whether it's the domestic violence or drug rehab or getting housing or any other counseling you need. You can't just put it off forever because every jurisdiction has time limits.
Absolutely.
And children need a permanent plan. And eventually, is it fair to say that if the parents have not rectified the problem, a child can be made a permanent ward of the state?
It's fair to say.
That's why I think that child protection work is the most important work that family court judges do. Because to me, when a child is permanently removed from parents, that's the capital punishment of family law. A parent's parental rights are terminated. And in the case of some children, what happens to them when they become permanent wards of the state?
It all depends on the circumstances, but what the Child Protection Agency normally does is look to other family to see if there's any family that would be able, willing to take on that child permanently.
Well, wouldn't that have been done before?
They do that beforehand, but sometimes they don't do the same scope of investigation. They look at all types of family, paternal family, maternal family,
but I think in most jurisdictions,
further investigate
child
it.
protection agencies have to look for family, an extended family that might be available, potential caregivers, before terminating the parental rights.
They do.
Entirely. So let's assume that was unsuccessful. It seems to me that the next step is to look for adoption.
An adoptive placement.
An adoptive placement.
Yes.
And for some children, that's not a reasonable option, is it?
Well, depending on the age of the child, what the child has experienced in his or her family of origin and in foster care, some children are not the most attractive to adoptive parents because somebody's taking on a lot to take on a child who's been through what some of these children have been through.
There are children that we see with special needs.
Yes.
Children with attachment disorder, developmental delays, children who have behavior problems.
I think all children who've gone into care permanently have special needs because of the experience of being taken away from their family.
It's a very traumatic area of law, and particularly for you, Crystal, who represents parents. How do you do it? How do you get parents to develop a plan and follow through to get their children back if their children have been taken away from them?
Not every parent can do this, and sometimes my job is to help a parent walk through the system knowing that they're likely to lose their child at the end of the day, but they're entitled to a vigorous legal defense. But many parents work very hard. They still may not be successful, but it's a privilege and an honor to work with the families that I work with.
Do children get a say in any of this?
Through the social worker, the children's views can become known. There's also circumstances, although here in BC it's not common, but for a child to be independently represented by counsel.
For a child to have their own lawyer. We have done an episode of Family Matters that focuses exclusively on children who have their own lawyers, and that includes in child protection cases. And in many jurisdictions, the courts will appoint a lawyer for the child. We're here in British Columbia, and in this jurisdiction you're saying that it doesn't always happen.
No.
But is it fair to say that in most child protection proceedings, if a child is old enough and mature enough, the court will know the child's views and preferences?
Yes.
And how do courts deal with situations where the children want to go home?
I think it's common to Jennifer and my experience that most of the children that we experience want to go home, and I think the social science evidence tells us that many of them, after they become adults and their permanent wardship is over, they do go home. So that's a common experience. Absolutely.
Even if they've been adopted?
Absolutely. Unlike like many people who are adopted in other circumstances, people want to seek out their families of origin.
Now that's an interesting point, because in recent years we're seeing more and more what we call open adoptions, where post-adoption contact is contemplated and even welcomed. That's something fairly new in the world of adoption, isn't it? I mean, it used to be that if a couple were adopting a child, there was great secrecy, and it was clear that there would be no contact with the birth parents. Now we're seeing cases where people willing to adopt children are open to continued contact with parents. This must give some hope to parents whose children are going to be removed from them permanently.
And it's a difficult area because depending on what the problem is that's resulted in the child being removed, the adopted parents may or may not want to have the parents from whom the children were taken involved in their lives. So again, this goes back to the point I was making about being cooperative. Those parents who are seen as cooperative, both by the agency involved and the potential adoptive parents, are more likely to see that openness at the end of the day.
And is it fair to say that most jurisdictions have a program or some laws that allow adults who have been adopted to seek out their birth parents, and vice versa, if they're all willing? We see that now too.
Yes.
We see that now too. So really, family connections may not necessarily begin and end with the law.
I think that for most people, family is forever. It may not be that you're able to live together or grow up in the same household, but I think in our culture we've turned around that idea of adoption, where we treated children as if they were born to that family and created a fiction from that. We're much more inclusive in the way that we define families now. That has to do both with this area of law and also the other areas in law in which we're now including as many helping, loving adults in a child's life as we can.
Now we have very little time left. This is a very rare opportunity for the public to hear from lawyers who work in this very difficult and fragile area. Are there any key messages you want people watching to know about child protection, about the system?
I think it's really important for people to know that, like Crystal had said earlier, you don't necessarily have to agree with what's been reported to an agency, but it's really important to cooperate, to communicate is a huge one with the social worker involved. It's really important, I would suggest, to get counsel to assist you in understanding the process and get involved in that, because by ignoring it, you're not doing yourself any good.
There you have it. There's nothing more important than keeping children healthy, happy, and safe. And if you're in a position where you are being invited by a child protection agency to cooperate with them and assist in making sure that your children's needs are met, make sure that you get the help that you need. From everyone here at Family Matters, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our guests for taking the time to be with us. See you next time.